This is a story about fish and people. It's the story of California's legendary runs of wild salmon and steelhead trout, what they mean to our culture and our economy, and how and why we may lose them. It's a story of the man-made dangers threatening the survival of these magnificent wild species, and of how the dangers can be reversed because they are man-made. And reversed they must be if these fishery resources, which have been an essential part of our heritage, are going to remain part of our future. Our story begins in late spring at Bodega Bay, where thousands have come to celebrate the opening of the salmon season and ceremonial blessing of the fishing fleet. The mood is festive, full of anticipation. The big attraction, a parade that each year grows more colorful and spectacular as hundreds of boats gather for this important occasion. It's a joyous beginning to what everyone hopes will be a prosperous season, and what a season it turns out to be. Throughout California, the exquisite flavor of fresh ocean-caught salmon is again on the menu, from the family barbecue to the finest restaurants. Each year, public demand for fine salmon increases. Michael Sabella, chef at his family-owned restaurant on San Francisco's Fisherman's Wharf, knows firsthand about this growing demand.
Salmon seems to be the most popular fish on our menu, which seems to be a little funny with all of the other local items that we have, sand dabs and petrale that people wouldn't get elsewhere. The salmon probably outsells all other fish, probably at least 2 to 1, closer to 3 to 1. I would say that probably the main reason why we sell so much salmon over the other fish is because we serve so many people from out of state, and actually so many people internationally. And I think there's 2 things that people think of when they think of Fisherman's Wharf. And one would, or actually 3, one would be sourdough bread. As far as the 2 seafood items, one would be our local Dungeness crab, and the other being our local salmon.
There's a romance about the fishery and the men and women who inhabit what some call the planet of water. That romance attracts thousands of visitors to coastal fishing communities every year. They come because they recognize that fishing is not just another way to make a living. It's a way of life.
Damn, these fish were near the top, and I've been fishing on the bottom. Are you getting any, Tommy? Are you getting any?
Up here. I gotta get ready for it.
Oh!
Fishing and fishermen have had a profound cultural influence on coastal and upriver towns. Fishing communities resonate with what writers call local color. Each year, the combination of fishing and tourism adds millions of dollars to the California economy. Fort Bragg is just one of the many communities thriving today on this combination. In addition to commercial salmon landings, Fort Bragg's annual 4th of July salmon barbecue is a major event. The whole community participates, and the tourists come by the thousands. Nat Bingham, a fisherman and Fort Bragg resident since the late 60s, talks about the importance of the fishery to his community.
Fishing makes up perhaps 1/3 of the local economy. Last year here in Fort Bragg, we had over 1 million pounds of fish delivered at a dockside average of $2.75 a pound. It went as high as $3. That made a vital contribution to the local economy.
Statewide, the commercial salmon catch had a dockside value last year of over $24 million, with landings from Crescent City to Morro Bay. Add Southern California processing and distribution facilities, and the retail value escalates to over $75 million. The sport fishery also makes a major economic contribution. More than 250,000 fishermen were out on the ocean last year salmon fishing. Peggy Beckett is one of the most popular charter boat captains working out of Half Moon Bay. Things can get hectic when the fish are on the bite, and several strike at once. But Peggy deftly moves the fishermen around so that their lines will not tangle as she instructs first-timers how to play their catch. The pleasure and satisfaction of landing a salmon has no measure, and for this young man, the memory of proudly displaying his first salmon to his father will glow for a lifetime. As the ocean fishery winds down in late summer and fall, river fishing begins. Few places in the United States attract more fishermen than California's North Coast streams. When the fish are biting, it's not unusual for fishermen to have to maneuver around each other to land their catch. And when fishing is slow, fishermen reminisce about the past, when returning salmon were said to be so thick one could walk across the river on their backs. Old-timers swear to the accuracy of this recollection, and it does point up the serious losses that have occurred to North Coast fishing stocks over the last 30 years. These losses are directly related to the effects of man's activities on the fragile landscape, primarily logging. The North Coast is a land of steep slopes and highly erodible soils. Add the heavy rainfall, and you have a combination that makes it some of the most unstable land in the nation, with widespread erosion, intense gullying, and massive landslides. The most serious problems began developing in the late 40s when the timber industry started logging with big tractors and other heavy equipment. Debris and sediment have poured down the mountainsides into the streams below. Thousands of miles of prime fishery habitat and hundreds of thousands of eggs and young fish have been destroyed. Since the 50s, North Coast salmon resources are thought to be down 50%, steelhead trout 75%. Faced with this continuing threat to their livelihood, fishermen assessed themselves a fee on their boats and began working with other community leaders on fundraising projects, such as Fort Bragg's famous salmon barbecue, to raise money to restore the habitat and restock the streams. Early stream restoration work concentrated on removing log jams so fish could reach upstream spawning grounds. Most of those barriers are gone now. Work today concentrates on efforts to keep sediment on the land and out of the water where it does so much harm. Here, the California Conservation Corps works with the California Department of Fish and Game to control the tow of a slide that is putting tons of sediment into a stream. Crew members push fallen logs into place, cabling them together to form a structure that will deflect water away from the eroding bank, giving riparian vegetation a chance to grow and protect the bank from further erosion. Since the late 70s, more than 700 miles of North Coast streams have been restored. Restored streams are being restocked through fish rearing programs developed by fishermen and community action groups. Young salmon and steelhead are hatched and raised until they are ready to migrate to the ocean. Keeping track of the returns is an essential part of the program. Adult salmon and steelhead are netted and tagged to monitor the movement of the fish and their habitat needs. Although the success of the past 10 years tells us that restoration efforts are working, we also know it costs much less to prevent the damage than to have to repair it. And unfortunately, new damage is occurring. A recent state review of timber harvest activities shows that up to 60% of the time, logging rules designed by the Board of Forestry to supposedly protect fishery resources are either ineffective or are not being enforced. Gail Lucas chairs a citizens task force working to implement timber harvest practices that will protect both streams and fishery habitat.
Most of the erosional problems take place within 2 to 10 years after logging occurs. A lot of it after a couple heavy winters of rainfall, and even more after the roots of logged trees decay. Once the logging was finished, the company could just leave the land, and if the erosion started the following year and continued on for years, which it does, it would simply erode into the streams and nobody would be responsible and no remedial action would have to be taken.
Recently, internationally owned timber companies have increased, in some cases doubled, the amount of timber they're cutting. Clear cutting is widespread, exposing thousands of acres to increased erosion and again destroying hundreds of miles of North Coast fishery habitat, including many of the streams restored over the past 10 years. Lucas and others, including Don Nelson, union representative for many of the loggers whose jobs and livelihood depend upon a stable timber industry, believe it is possible to harvest timber in a way that protects fishery resources.
Proper logging can eliminate the problems. If good stream buffers are left, the shade remains. If care is taken, soil can be prevented from running into streams. But that does take care and thought.
Yeah, I believe that the timber industry and the fishing industry are very compatible. They should be compatible, and they can both be healthy within the North Coast area.
Unless timber harvest practices are brought under control, North Coast fishery resources still could be lost in spite of restoration successes. About 30% of ocean-caught salmon come from North Coast rivers. The other 70% come from Central Valley rivers, primarily the Sacramento system. Central Valley salmon are almost all Chinook or king salmon, the most prized of the salmon species. Although last year's catch was the best in many years, it still was down by half from catches made prior to the 1950s. Both salmon and steelhead began to disappear when the dams and water diversions of the federal Central Valley project came online. Now we are faced with ultimately losing the wild stocks. Since the habitat needs of both salmon and steelhead are similar, the best way to understand why the wild stocks are so threatened is to follow the Sacramento River salmon through a complete cycle of their life history. To spawn, the fish leave the ocean where they have been feeding and growing for at least 3 years to follow the Sacramento and its tributaries back to the place of their birth. For many, it's an upriver journey of more than 200 miles, and for the spawning salmon, it will be the final act of their lives. Although some steelhead return to spawn more than once, all Pacific salmon die soon after spawning. The fish are guided upstream by a remarkable sense of smell. The unique chemistry of each stream gives it a special odor, an odor nature imprints on the fish within the first 10 days of life. Even though the water of the natal stream mixes with that of other streams and may be diluted to as much as 1 part per billion by the time it reaches the ocean, it is this odor that guides the fish back to the site of their birth. Among the salmon migrating up the Sacramento, about half will end their lives in hatcheries that were built to mitigate the loss of habitat when dams were constructed on the American and Feather rivers, which flow into the Sacramento. The wild stocks continuing up the Sacramento to spawn in the river face a series of life-threatening obstacles. Those that spawn successfully do so against great odds. The first major barrier is the Red Bluff Diversion Dam, built as part of the federal Central Valley project and operated by the Bureau of Reclamation. Although fishways were constructed on both sides of the dam to allow the fish to pass, they have never effectively worked. More than 1/4 of the fish approaching the dam never get past. Of those that manage to find the fishways, many will have been delayed for more than a month, struggling in the waters below the dam. For some females, this delay will have been too long for successful spawning. Once their eggs have ripened, they no longer can hold them. In open water, the eggs are quickly eaten by other fish. Spawning is fascinating to watch. There is constant movement as the fish restlessly scour the spawning grounds, searching for the site of their choice. Males jockey for position behind soon-to-spawn females. There is usually a dominant male. If others get too close, they are aggressively chased away. Females waiting for their eggs to ripen guard their chosen spawning sites. When the female is ready, she uses her powerful tail to dig a nest in which to deposit her eggs. The eggs are fertilized by the male as they settle into the nest, which also is known as a redd, from the Scottish to make ready. After spawning, the salmon die. Even as their lives slowly ebb away, females diligently guard their nests. The section of the river between the Red Bluff Diversion Dam and Shasta Dam is the reach most preferred by the fish. When Shasta was constructed in the 1940s, the fish lost close to 200 miles of prime spawning habitat above the dam. Below the dam, they lost additional spawning sites as good spawning gravels were carried downstream by the river's currents and replacement gravels were trapped behind the dam. Lack of good spawning gravel is a constant problem, but it is not the most worrisome. The most pressing problem is water. The fish need stable flows with water temperatures around 58 degrees. They also need a good supply of oxygen. Warm water cooks the eggs, and without oxygen, eggs and young fish cannot survive. Within a few weeks after emerging from the gravels, the young fish begin a perilous downriver journey as they make their way to the ocean. In the beginning, they are drift feeders carried tail first by the downstream currents. Those that can stay close to shore. Not only is it cooler, but here in the shadows of rocks and overhanging vegetation, they can hide from predators. They also find more food here, feeding on insects that drop from branches and leaves. As the fish move downstream, a process known as smoltification begins, a biological change that will enable them to live in salt water. Unfortunately, most will never make it to the ocean, and those that start above the Red Bluff Diversion Dam have less chance of doing so than those that start below. The Bureau of Reclamation does not operate this dam to protect young fish. Each year, Red Bluff losses deprive fishermen of 225,000 catchable salmon and future stocks of 114,000 spawning adults. If the Bureau would adjust the dam gates during the critical days when the fry and smolts are migrating seaward, most fish could safely pass. Instead, the fish are caught in the turbulent currents that sweep under dam gates that are closed. Below the dam, they are tossed to the surface, confused and vulnerable, right into the jaws of hungry squawfish, waiting for them in the downstream eddies and currents. For those that escape the squawfish, the fight for survival goes on. Although the surface of the river looks tranquil, beneath the surface, young fish are caught up in more than 300 unscreened water diversions that line the river between Red Bluff and the city of Sacramento. Along with the water, the fish are pulled out of the river to die in ditches and fields. Other killers are fish screens that don't work, such as this one at the Glen Colusa Irrigation District, where millions of young fish are trapped and die at the district screens every year. Many of these losses could be prevented. Well-designed fish screens work. Working screens should be required on all water diversions. Further downstream, near the city of Sacramento, the river crosses the invisible line that defines the northernmost boundary of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The biggest killers of all still lay ahead. In the heart of the Delta, near Antioch, the waters of the Sacramento River join those of the San Joaquin River coming in from the south. Together, the rivers flow toward San Francisco Bay and the ocean. Within the Delta, with its many islands and channels, the direction and flow of these two great river systems are controlled by the rate at which water is pulled out of the Delta by the pumps of the Federal Central Valley Project at Tracy and the State Water Project at Clifton Court. These pumps are so powerful, they can affect the flow of the Sacramento more than 30 miles upstream, pulling water out of the river into the central Delta through an artificial channel known as the Delta Cross Channel. Along with the water, the migrating smolts also are pulled into the central Delta. Here they are forced to travel a confusing, circuitous route through the complex Delta channels as they struggle to find their way to the ocean. Less than 50% will survive their Delta journey. Many will mistakenly head into the South Delta toward the massive water project pumps. These pumps not only pull water from great distances, their force is so strong they actually reverse the flows in some South Delta channels. The fish, thinking they are swimming toward the ocean, follow the direction of the flow toward the pumps. In spite of fish salvaging activities, pumping losses claim up to 80% of the fish coming down the Sacramento and 95% of the fish coming out of the San Joaquin. According to testimony by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service at hearings in Sacramento, these losses could be prevented simply by increasing bypass flows during the critical days in May and June when the smolts are migrating seaward. Richard Halleck, retired Department of Fish and Game biologists who has worked on Sacramento River salmon and steelhead issues most of his professional life, agrees that what the fish need first and foremost is water.
The salmon and steelhead must spend a part of their life cycle in our rivers and streams. One of the most critical elements relative to their survival and reproduction is the water itself. I think that the Central Valley Project in itself has done more to destroy salmon and steelhead in this valley than any other one thing.
One cannot help but ask, why are the fish not getting the water they need? The answer lies in the influence of power on California history. The story begins in the early 1900s with efforts by local farming communities in the San Joaquin Valley to provide a water supply to cultivate their crops. This was a legitimate need then and continues to be so today for the true farmers who grow products to put on our tables. But there are others who call themselves farmers, corporate agribusiness giants, paper farmers who grow crops to harvest government subsidies. Using subsidized water from the Central Valley Project, they grow thousands of acres of surplus crops like cotton and rice. With these crops, they use government price support programs to collect federal subsidy dollars. Pyramiding subsidy on top of subsidy, they have erected multi-million-dollar empires. One California agribusiness giant is reported to have received subsidy payments of more than $20 million in 1 year alone. The water they use is taken from the fish. We no longer can afford the water development schemes set in motion many years ago. The way water is now used and misused in California has resulted in serious inequities. The equity issue affects all Californians because both water and the fishery are public resources. But it most immediately affects the fishermen who already have lost or are in danger of losing their livelihood. Through fishery losses, fishermen are indirectly subsidizing the agribusiness subsidy machine. As the fishery has declined, so has the salmon fleet. The number of boats fishing for salmon has gone from 5,000 in the late 70s to half that number today.
When the fishing industry is damaged, the whole community suffers because it's a primary industry and the dollars that go in turn over 2 or 3 times in the local economy before they leave the area.
In spite of the losses, water development interests want more. The issue is closely followed by William Keir, expert on land, water use, and fishery issues, and consultant to the California Advisory Committee on Salmon and Steelhead Trout.
The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which operates the Central Valley Project, believes it has an additional 1 million acre-feet of water to remove from the system. Salmon and steelhead are being adversely affected by water operations now, and it will only get worse. Further sales of water will only aggravate this situation.
The water developers would have us believe that increasing reliance on hatchery production while allowing the wild stocks to decline is the answer to our fishery problems. Hatcheries were built as an attempt to mitigate the loss of more than 8,000 miles of natural habitat as more and more dams blocked our rivers and streams. And although hatcheries do have a place in overall fishery management, they also have definite limits. Their problems are legend, disease, uncontrollable water temperatures, human error, any one of which can wipe out a season's entire run of fish, and has done so. In the long run, however, the most serious problems relate to the clone-like fish hatcheries produce. Hatchery fish lack the genetic diversity of fish born in the wild. We should take a lesson from Oregon and British Columbia, where they have discovered just how dangerous reliance on hatchery stocks can be. Fish born in the wild have an amazing resilience to adverse conditions and environmental change. In fact, biologists say given the water they need and what remains of their habitat protected, their numbers could be increased, perhaps doubled. Such an increase would have many benefits. At the very least, it would help keep pace with growing public demand as the health benefits of salmon become more widely known. The Salmon and Steelhead Advisory Committee has examined the economics of increased production and what it would mean to California.
This business of conserving or restoring salmon and steelhead is beyond being the right thing to do, is a smart thing to do as well. The Advisory Committee on Salmon and Steelhead has looked extensively into the economics of the restoration program that we're proposing. And we estimate that business revenues would be increased in California by something on the order of $150 million a year. That this doubling of salmon and steelhead numbers from today's modest levels to 2 million king salmon, for example, would over time create an economic benefit to California of $6 billion. The amount of economic activity that would be generated by the salmon and steelhead restoration program would create about 5,000 new jobs, primarily in areas of underemployment in rural California.
But is information like this enough to break the agribusiness lock on control of California water? State Senator Barry Keene has spearheaded the fight in the California legislature to bring about fishery restoration and water policy changes.
What we're really trying to do is reverse the very damaging policies of the last generation. And in order to do that, we're going to need an outpouring of letters, telephone calls, and other communications from you to your local legislators and to the governor of the state of California. That's the only way we can undo the havoc and devastation that's been wrought on this rare, rich natural heritage that belongs to all Californians.
For the millions of Californians who want a voice in determining the fate of these important resources, the time to speak out is now, while further losses can still be prevented. Unless the public sends government and the politicians a strong, clear message that they want the wild stocks of salmon and steelhead protected and restored, little will be done. Business as usual will continue in the water development world. The wild stocks of salmon and steelhead will eventually disappear. The jobs, the communities, the way of life dependent on the fishery balance on the edge.